Team, we are going to expand upon our discussion of the development of the West African empires with Flip Video 3.3. Please title this as What Were the Defining Characteristics of the Early West African Empires? So, we're going to start off by discussing the commonalities, since the connection to the content that we have been studying and what we are studying is that we're going to be exploring the expansion of Islam throughout the North and West African empires, and we're specifically looking at the commonalities and differences with the ways in which Islam impacted those societies and ways in which the societies impacted the Islamic beliefs and structure. So let's start off with some key commonalities with the Arab world. And when I say the Arab world, I am referencing the area that is, oh, don't let me do it. The area right over here, which is the area that was controlled, the original Arabian Peninsula, where Muhammad established his empire and his Islamic community. So you can see from the map on the right, which we've already discussed, this entire Islamic world, as Islam began to spread, was known as Dar al-Islam, the world of Islam, that united political, social, and economic empire. So one of the key commonalities among just the basic, in addition to the basic fact that these places share Islamic faith, is that they were all guided by Islamic law. The term to describe that, of course, was the Sharia law, which we've already learned. But the Sharia law and this concept that the entire community should be based upon the concepts of Islam, it guided the creation of the societies and it guided the societies themselves. But as we'll see, Islam was experienced in a different way politically and socially and culturally in West Africa than it had been in the Arab world. So, for example, some key differences with the Arab world. Religiously, there was a far greater peaceful coexistence with other religions than there was in the Arab world. So, as we recall, the Arab world was defined by a tremendous amount of violence and resistance to the creation of Islam and the spread of Islam. There was a far greater peaceful coexistence between Islam and other faiths in West Africa. However, part of this coexistence was really because Islam began to blend with many of the native animistic faiths that were already present in Africa, in West Africa. Jump down for a second to the bottom of the text box here. Animism is the belief that inanimate, which means non living objects, have souls. And this is traditionally associated with many of the ethnic faiths. These are faiths and religious beliefs that have been passed down from generation to generation. Islam began to sort of coexist with that. The formal term of this would be they'd be experiencing cultural syncretism, where one cultural group or cultural trait is going to blend with another cultural trait to create something that's entirely new and unique. So that concept of the syncretism was not present in the Arab world and very much was in the West African world. So we see a more peaceful coexistence, yet a slightly new take on the implementation of these beliefs. Leadership. Leadership styles and leadership practices were different between the Arab world and West Africa. Often, if I'm referencing this map of Dar al-Islam, you see the spread into West Africa. The conversion of people to the Islamic faith was much more gradual and I already mentioned more peaceful. And a lot of that is because often it was the leaders who converted to the faith of Islam, but many people themselves maintained their animistic traditions. So there was sort of a slow trickle down effect over time of more and more people converting to Islam because the leaders themselves didn't necessarily force that conversion upon people. There wasn't that jizya tax that was the case. Now, we will talk about, and you saw in the video in class, that there is a brief period of time where there was an invading group who did force some to convert, but for the most part, this process was really a gradual and peaceful process that was a top-down initiated change. Another key difference with the Arab world is the role of women, so gender roles. Women had greater freedom in Africa and the West African kingdoms than they did in the Arab world. So there was some the creation of the Sharia law, despite some of the practices of the Quran. Well, let me back it up for a second. Let's keep in mind that women at this time period were not viewed with equality just across the board in this period of time. That women were not seen as equals to men. So much of the Sharia law was based upon lines of the Quran that were then interpreted to say that women should not necessarily have as much power as men. So much of the Arab world, for example, women were accompanied by men when they left the house. Women were veiled, meaning they would wear the hijab, which is the head covering, or the full burqa. In reality, that comes from a line of the text of the Quran that says that both men and women should be dressing piously, which means with reverence. But let's boil this back down to the Arab versus the African world. Many of the women of the African world did not adopt those same cultural traditions as was the case in West Africa. We'll pause there for a second. So Similarly, or I should say, a similar difference between the Arab world and the Muslim world, much of this gender role difference stemmed from the fact that women had a different role in society in many of the West African kingdoms. In particular, the West African kingdoms are large, where many of them were based upon matriarchal societies or matriarchal beliefs. And a matriarchal society, which is the opposite of a patriarchal society, which we discussed when we talked about China, that in this system, the lineage, so meaning your heritage, is traced through your mother. And so inherently, or which means sort of naturally, that's going to put women in a more significant role within the family and within social connections. So we see that women, for example, they did in Africa. They walked, as I mentioned, they walked around freely. They weren't necessarily veiled. Women had a higher power in the society. So visually, Islam was not necessarily experienced in the same way, and that reigns true to this day. Many of the West African places, many women do not necessarily practice some of the same cultural practices that you would see in the Arab world. Some do, but some don't. So there's just sort of a variety of choice that is involved there as well. Now, let's dive a little more deeply into a specific defining question. What are the defining characteristics of these West African kingdoms and these empires? One of the key characteristics that we've discussed already is the gold salt trade. So we have the Trans-Sahara trade, which I showed on the map here, somewhat. Okay, you can see some of that's an incomplete map, but a partial map of the Trans-Sahara trade route. The gold salt trade, more specifically, is the reference to the trade of gold coming from the south and salt coming from the Sahara Desert and being traded between empires. And this trade drove much of the wealth of the West African empires. The salt, of course, was used to preserve meat in a time period when there was no refrigeration, so that people could eat the meat. And the gold was considered the most valuable. It was the currency of the world and remains so valuable across the world. So the way this was executed was with camels who traveled all across the Sahara Desert. Without the camels, this truly would not have been possible at this time. And as I said here, the access to gold in West Africa is the fact that they had the access to the gold mines is really what ensured that that these would be prosperous, thriving, economically strong and stable communities. And it wasn't just the fact that they had the gold, but the people who came into Ghana to trade were too taxed by the Ghanaian leadership and later the Mali leadership and the Songhai leadership. So that it was a combination of having access to gold plus the taxes that were placed upon the traders that drove much of this wealth. Coming up next, here's Ghana. Pausing it for a second. So as I just alluded to, the first united West African empire. Oh, and the wrong map is shown there. So ignore that map for a second. The Ghana was the first united West African empire. It was founded by the Malinke people. And as mentioned, it was the fantastic gold the gold that drove the fantastic wealth of the Ghana Empire. Eventually, the Ghanaian Empire was invaded by the Berbers in 1076. We're going to spend some time talking about justice that was executed by the Ghanaian kings at this time. And it was a particularly impressive practice of bringing all of the people together to voice concerns directly to their leader, a true sign of the social and political organization of this group, and was carried through into the subsequent empire known as the Mali Empire. The Mali Empire, which is now accurately shown on that map there. There was a civil war in Ghana, as I mentioned. The Berbers came in and invaded. They too wanted access to that trade into the gold and the salt. And the leadership that ultimately emerged and the foundation of the Mali Empire was the result of, and I'm going to take this date out just for a minute, so don't take that date down. But by a man named Sundiata Keita, and Sundiata Keita was given the title, or as I guess self-appointed the title of Mansa, which means leader. So Mansa Sundiata Keita is the founder of the Mali Empire. Common theme here, another fantastically wealthy empire. Obviously, they're controlling the same trade routes. And in particular, what Mali built upon was control of the agricultural trade. So the farming practices here in West Africa, where the primary crops that were grown were rice, millet, and sorghum, which are two different grains. They look very similar to wheat, which is also grown. Fruits and vegetables. And by creating these cultural and trading centers, Mali was able to create a very economically stable and very prosperous empire here in West Africa. And you can see some of the trade routes on the bottom, the map on that bottom right there. It was specifically under Mali, the Mali Empire, that Islam's influence truly began to grow in a large and measurable way. More specifically, Sundiata Keita's nephew, a man named Mansa Musa, was one of the key leaders who himself was responsible for the spread of Islam across the empire and really expanding it beyond just something that the elite or that the leadership themselves would practice. What Mansa is most known for was his very famous Hajj, and his Hajj was the same Hajj we're referencing, that trip back to Mecca. He was so fantastically wealthy that he brought with him over 1,000 followers. He had 100 camels with over 300 pounds of gold each. He had slaves, and that's something we'll return to shortly. But I really like to focus on his just unbelievable wealth that he was bringing with him on this Hajj. When he was on this Hajj, he gave away so much gold. He's known for this unbelievable generosity of giving away gold to people all both within Mecca and to and from on his journey, that gold itself became less valuable because so many people had it. It was truly an unbelievable amount of wealth that was being distributed and an unbelievable amount of generosity. So he's truly known for both of those things. Similarly, he's also known for building for helping to foster a culture of Islamic learning and of arts within the West African empires. So he built great mosques, he expanded Islamic law, and he really helped develop many of the artistic traditions that were present in these Islamic centers. So, for example, we can put on the left-hand side there the major multicultural and learning centers of Gao, Janay, and Timbuktu. These are some of his most significant places that were known all across the entire Islamic world as being centers of learning and centers of academic study. So there you would find international poets, artists, scholars. Mansa Musa helped to develop libraries and universities. I mean, this is at a time when books are extremely rare. So this was truly a sign both of the prosperity, but also just the intellect and the power of these civilizations. You can see some of the very unique architecture that was developed at that time using the resources that were available within the area. These are actually famous mosques that were built in ancient Mali, or in medieval Mali, I should say. Eventually, Mali faced some internal threats in a large empire, and a large, very wealthy empire. It's not surprising that they faced threats from invaders. Eventually, Mali fell, but Timbuktu continued to flourish under subsequent, which means the following, leadership of Songhai. It's also spelled with a Y, but they're one and the same. This too was the empire, generally in the same location, ruled by Muslim leaders. Sunni Ali is the person who's most responsible for expanding the trade routes in the Songhai Empire. And something that was a little bit more well developed under the Songhai Empire was this exchange of slaves, and this happened both within with the slave trade within Africa and then ultimately outside, which we'll return to later on. But let's be clear. Let's remind ourselves of just how unbelievably intelligent, capable, powerful, and prosperous these civilizations were far before the arrival of any Europeans on the African continent. So an important piece. You can see here just again the massive amount of expansive trade. This is specifically the trade routes that were developed and maintained and controlled by the Songhai Empire. They had moved their capital city to Gao, which you can see in the bottom right there, just just to the southeast of Timbuktu. But this is all happening generally in the same region. That these were all the cultural and economic and learning centers of West Africa. So there we are. There are your analysis questions, and we'll see you soon.